as I started traveling and doing more work on the issue of globalization, it struck me that water was the most important, probably ecological and human rights crisis of our time, and that some people were working on the environmental or shortage issue and others were working on the human rights issue, but there wasn't a coalition movement coming together to address these together. So I wrote a report for the International Forum on Globalization, which morphed into the book Blue Gold, which has been a really interesting experience. It's taken me all over the world, and I work in countries rich and poor with people of all types. I've worked with grassroots movements around the world, and it has come to be a very great passion for me, this fight around water. You hear a lot about energy. I was at a conference on energy not long ago, energy shortages and the crisis in energy, and every single person in there was either writing a book or just had finished one or something. And I thought it was interesting that the elite in our world is real nervous about energy because, and I thought, you know, why is that now? And they're not talking at all about water when energy, in fact, the lack of energy hasn't killed anybody in our world, right? Whereas there's a child dying every 8 seconds in our world from waterborne disease. And in fact, if you take the number of people who die from poor water, bad quality water every day, or the lack of clean water, it would be an equivalent of 24 jumbo jets crashing every day in our world. So how come everybody's talking about energy? And I have to tell you, I think it's because the issue of energy has to do with market capitalism and global markets and the, economic globalization, and it's been the cheap fuel has been the fuel for economic globalization. And maybe the people who are dying of water don't matter to many of those who are keen to move forward with economic globalization because they're not in the system anyway, they're the poor. So we need to start talking about this issue because it is truly a huge environmental and human rights crisis. On one hand, you have the ecological reality of growing water scarcity. Now, this shouldn't be, because we all learned back in grade 4 or whatever that there's a finite hydrologic cycle, there's a finite amount of water, it rains on us, it evaporates and goes back in the form of up to the clouds and comes back in the form of rain to us. And it can't go anywhere. And that's all true, except that what we didn't understand was that it was possible for us to deplete, pollute, and divert the finite amount of water that we have in the world, the surface water, to the point where it's no longer accessible. And it would be hard for me to overemphasize the amount of pollution that exists around the world in terms of surface water. 75% of India's surface water is polluted beyond use. 80% of China's surface water is polluted. Latin America, which should have one of the highest per capita allocations of water in the world because they have so much water, has actually the lowest, and it's because of massive groundwater or surface water pollution, as well as, of course, deep inequities between classes. And so we're now mining groundwater far faster than it can be replenished by nature. And I deliberately use the term mining because it's not like sustainable use, which uses groundwater at a rate that doesn't deplete it faster than it can be replenished. But we now have companies coming in and treating water pockets the way they treat gold or any other sort of precious metal. That is, you take it till it's gone and then you move on. In the United States now, they're dependent on groundwater for over 50% of their daily use of water. So, I mean, it's really dramatically increasing. This is happening so fast, this destruction of ground surface and groundwater, that the World Bank, the Pacific Institute, the World Watch Institute, the UN are telling us now that unless we dramatically change our ways, 2/3 of the world's population will not have access to clean water by the year 2025. I mean, we're talking about escalating crisis. They're now talking about what they call hot stains. These are parts of the world that are already running out, and they can actually calculate when it will be gone. And please understand, we're not talking cyclical drought. We're talking end of water. The Middle East, pretty well every country, you can tabulate 25 to 35. One country has 50 years left if they're careful. 22 countries in Africa are in severe crisis right now as we speak. Australia and the entire that entire area, massive parts of Latin America because of pollution. Certainly, Mexico City is literally sinking in on itself. It's called subsidence. They've taken so much of the water underneath Mexico City and beyond that the city is literally collapsing in on itself. There's talk that they may have to move Mexico City. How do you move Mexico City? They don't even know how many people there are there. And of course, massive parts of the United States, which people don't want to recognize as being in severe crisis. California, the entire Midwest, the entire Southwest are experiencing a dry spell. Says the Geological Survey, the worst dry time in 500 years. And I was at a conference in Boise, Idaho last spring, and the scientists and the water managers stood up and said to everybody, read our lips, this is not cyclical drought. And the only reason that this isn't looking worse than it might, or worse than the 1930s, is that post the drought in the 30s, they implemented a whole series of reservoirs. But now the reservoirs are being depleted, and when they're gone, there's no backup for what's happening. The Chicago Basin is scheduled to be using dramatic increases in the next few years, and of course it's exempted from the Great Lakes Agreement, so whatever the diversion Chicago takes is just coming down off the lakes, and so on. California has 20 years left. New Mexico has 10 years left. I was in New Mexico last year and met with people fighting to bring a consciousness about water there. They have, as I say, a 10-year window of water left, groundwater left, and they're building golf courses and swimming pools and, huge lawns as fast as they can. And they remind me of the Far Side cartoon where there's little dogs in a life raft and the big ship's going down, and one of them says, okay, everybody in favor of using all the food at once, put your hand up, right? It's like, okay, maybe if we really hurry, we could make that only 5 years instead of giving ourselves a 10-year window. But for Canadians, this is a very important subject. China, just give you one last example. China is a country that is modernizing at an unparalleled pace in human history. There are cities going up in the middle of China as big as New York, quite a few of them. And to do this so that every running shoe and shower curtain liner that anybody buys has come from China, they have diverted massive amounts of water from their north, where they grow grain to feed their billion-plus people, to their industry in the south. And China has destroyed its water table, not only its surface water, but a very disturbing new study says from the UN and the World Health Organizations tells us that 90% of the groundwater under the major cities in China is polluted. So, I mean, we're talking massive, massive reality here. Now, China has just announced it's going to help itself to Tibet's water. And that's how it'll solve its problem. Well, of course, the ice caps are melting in that area of the world, just as they are everywhere. And its statement that Tibet will give it water for 1,000 years is a false statement, but that's not what China's saying. So we're talking about what one scientist described to me, as he said, it's like the Earth is like an apple. Still green, mostly green, but it's got these spots, brown spots, where it's drying up from the inside. And so if we just look at the issue of access and equality with the notion that all you have to do is find more hookups for the 2 billion people in the world who don't have it, we're not going to get ourselves where we need to go. We have to talk massive conservation right now. So that's the one issue. The other, of course, is the fact that the vast majority of the 2 billion people in the world who don't have access to clean water live in third world countries, or are from the class in the country that they come from, where their poverty levels are such that they can't afford to buy water, and of course the only water available is water for sale. It's very, very related, as I say, to class divisions. It's related, of course, to the fact that even the wealthy in those countries have all the water they need for golf courses. There's all the water you need for tourism and so on. But the reality is that we have a huge growing water divide in our world between those who have all the money they need to buy all the water they could ever wish, who live in a very water-rich lifestyle and those who have none. I remember being at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in South Africa several years ago. This was Rio +10. And the summit was actually held in the very rich area of Johannesburg with skyscrapers and gorgeous five-star hotels and little boutique water on everybody's desk. Everywhere you went, even in the washrooms, there were different boutique waters. And it was right next to one of the townships that actually had a river running through it with cholera warning signs on it. So just the stark contrast between what you could have, the water you could have if you were able to be on this side of the township, and the water that you had access to if you were on the other. I remember also going into one of the townships on that trip and seeing water finally being brought up to people's doors in the poorest imaginable kind of conditions, no running water anywhere, rats in the gutters, burning tires and so on. But finally, because the Constitution of South Africa said there is a right to water, there are these pipes, but between the pipe and the tap is a state-of-the-art water meter. And to get access to the water meter and to get water at all, you have to pay for an electronic key that you charge up. And so you could see people just looking at that water meter with the little, you can see it adding up the waters. One friend of mine said, I can afford about 2 flushes a week. That's what I can afford. So people, of course, are looking at the taps and walking further and further away to their water sources. The women in South Africa alone walk the average of to the moon and back 16 times every day to fetch water. And all the diseases, the communicable diseases that we thought were gone are back. Cholera, including, by the way, the plague. So bad is the water crisis in South Africa and other countries. So now, what have we learned? Oh, and I want to say that there's a huge implication for cities around this issue, and that is taking water from the poor, from peasants. There are huge, because water is becoming so scarce, and the reality in many countries is that it is so precious now. There are great contests happening, and one of them, of course, is city versus rural or city versus indigenous. And you get situations like Mexico City, which has just built a pipeline kilometers, hundreds of kilometers away, gone into the territory of the Mazawas people and just taken their water. They basically confiscated it and then taken the water, built a great big kind of fortress around it with armed guards and barbed wire and dogs and so on surveying it, and just piped that water back into Mexico City. So we're beginning to see that there are huge implications for cities in these huge mega cities that are being created. Another implication for cities that I would like to warn you about or kind of place a red light on is some studies that have been done around the more we pave and urbanize our environment, the less place there is for water to return to us from the natural cycle. There were early studies on this were done a few years ago by Dr. Michael Kravcik and his colleagues in Slovakia. And they were actually able to quantify that for every percentage of paving over, there's actually a decrease in the actual hydrologic cycle. And the way Dr. Kravcik explained it to me, because I know the politics more of it, and I had to teach myself a little more of the science and environment of this. He said it's like the rain that has come up, it's evaporated from fields and meadows and wetlands and so on, but that's all paved over, so when the rain comes back, it can't settle back into those places, and it's as if it hits a cement umbrella, and it's being taken off to the sea. Dr. Kravcik says that he believes this is at least as responsible as global warming for the rising of the oceans, is the creation of cities that don't have green spaces, that don't build in a way that the hydrologic cycle can be maintained with integrity. So now we are running out of clean water. We are polluting, diverting, and just destroying by bad use clean water around the world. So water, as I said, is becoming dramatically contested. I call it blue gold because some in the private sector have moved in and realized that this is an area with great potential in the future. Forbes magazine had a very important special a couple of years ago on the future of water investments. They said, this is it, this is the big investment. As people desperately need water, and the fact that there's no substitute, people will pay anything they can. And so will countries, so will communities, so will corporations. And they said, and I quote, whoever controls water in the future will be both powerful and wealthy. Some of these companies are moving in to set up a kind of cartel around fresh water, kind of like the energy companies are now claiming oil and gas before it's even out of the ground. When they find a new find of energy, it's claimed and staked out by the big companies. Well, we're going to hear more stakeouts around water and what I call water hunters. It's three types of massive privatization that are taking place. The first is the big service companies, Suez, the one that built the Suez Canal, Veolia, which used to be Vivendi, and RWE Thames are the biggest, three biggest. They're all European. These companies, these water service companies, are so powerful and wealthy, they're all in the top 100 of the world's Fortune 500, 100 biggest and most powerful and wealthy countries. Suez has 400,000 employees in its water unit alone. So it is bigger than the government of many of the countries in which it operates. And how these companies have operated is this. The World Bank in the 1980s started telling third world countries that owed a debt, look, we'll give you debt reallocation or debt renegotiation if you bring in the Washington Consensus model of governance, which is deregulation, privatization, free trade, let our companies come in and run your social services. First things to be privatized were health and education. Water came later. In the mid-1990s, however, the World Bank started to pressure third world countries very hard, and to the extent that now, last year, there was not one single piece of funding or loan for any developing country for water that did not have conditionality of privatization. So not only did they say you have to privatize to get our aid, we'll tell you what companies to bring in, we will make the agreement with the companies, and there's even been a financial restructuring because the companies are meeting such resistance that now the World Bank has agreed that it will fund them and guarantee these companies a certain level of profit, whether or not they make the profit in the third world. So it's a very, very contentious issue. Oliver was saying that we had met in Kyoto, where the World Water Forum, which is kind of the World Water Council holds this forum every 3 years. They've set themselves up as a global high command of water. It's basically the big water companies and the World Bank and so on. And we went to the meeting where they announced this new funding measures. A man named Michael Kamdesu, who was before that head of the International Monetary Fund. And our Japanese friends had said, now we don't protest here, we don't do that. So you have to find, politer ways of saying what you want to say. So there was an audience of maybe 2,000 people in this huge room when this new financing package was announced. And we had about 300 of our folks around the room, and we had what we call line meters, and they were just little drawings of a meter with, going from soft yellow to bright red with a little meter on it. They were called lie meters, and they had little bells. So when Michael Kamdesu told a little lie, there were a couple of tinkles, and as he said more things we disagree with, the tinkles intensified. And one of the funniest moments of my life was when the great Michael Kamdesu, in front of this huge audience of powerful, important people, said, "Stop that tinkling." It was just a lovely moment. Everybody, tinkle, tinkle, tinkle. We tinkled a lot at that particular moment. I have to tell you that there are several very new studies out that say that the privatization project in the third world has been a massive failure. A very new important study called Pipe Dreams shows that the hookups have been so pathetic, hookups by literally, I mean hookups to the water system in the areas targeted by the United Nations, that it says the United Nations Millennium Goal of 50% of people who need it by 2015 will take 2 centuries at this rate. More importantly, what they found was that the assumption by northern countries and the banks was that there would be more funding in the third world for water when the private companies came in, and so they defunded, and there's been a net reduction in money in the global south for water development over the last 10 years. So the companies are leaving. They're leaving places like La Paz in Bolivia, where Suez came in, got the contract to provide water, lied, said that they would bring water to the people, poor people and the indigenous people in the hills called El Alto, which is over La Paz. Instead, they put up a plant fortress under the water melt, the snow melt on Mount Illimani, and they took the water. They're still doing it because the negotiations are now underway for Suez to leave, but you can still see the plant delivering water in a pipe to people in La Paz who cannot pay for it. And the 200,000 people in the local communities not only are not hooked up, but they had their water source surrounded by armed guards and dogs. So literally children are dying. I was in one community where the international aid agencies had built a lovely little clinic, health clinic, and a school, and neither was operating because there wasn't a drop of fresh water in the community. So we are talking about situations where literally poor people are being denied water to the point where they're dying if they cannot buy it. And there's been such a revolution around this, and it is so intense and has had so little media in this country that it is really quite astounding. There's also taking of water by bottled water companies. Now, bottled water may seem like not as big an issue, and in some ways it's not, as these huge service companies, but massive bottling of water is a very recent thing, and it has allowed us to consider water as a commodity and to not be so worried if our public systems aren't good or we think they might be declining or they really are declining because, well, I can buy it. I'd never trust that tap water anyway, so I'll just buy it. And I have to tell you that we figure that last year, and this is a conservative statistic, there were about 200 billion liters of water put in plastic bottles around the world, and that's growing at 20% a year. Now try to imagine 200 billion plastic bottles ending up in landfills, garbage dumps, rivers, wetlands, forests. We are creating a huge new pollution problem because, of course, the bottles are made of chemicals and fossil fuels, right? I mean, believe me, you don't want to drink bottled water unless you have to. It's not a safe way to be accessing water, but it has become so pervasive for those who can afford it around the world that it's a huge issue. Coca-Cola, just give you one example, is using the satellite imagery from the American military in India to find out where the groundwater sources are, and going into tribal and rural and poor communities and setting up huge bottling plants. And they're just literally sucking the water dry out of communities. I was in Pachamada, Kerala, which is in the south of India, last year, and sat with women who've been holding a daily vigil for 3 years. And I'm saying little babies to 95-year-old women get up at the crack of dawn and they sit all day in a silent vigil and they don't go home till late at night when they sleep and come back. There's manicured, huge plant with lawns, green lawns in the middle of this very poor community has come under just a huge protest. And very recently, the highest court under the Supreme Court, it's now going to the Supreme Court, but the next level has just told Coca-Cola that it's going to have to stop its bottling in Pachamada because it's destroying the water tables. All over India, there's a campaign called Quit Coke India. But this notion that water is privatized and should be allowed to be bought and hoarded is really growing. I call them water hunters. I was in Lubbock, Texas for a conference not long ago, and they were bemoaning but didn't think there was anything they could do about the fact that T. Boone Pickens, who's this billionaire guy down there, is buying up all the water sources and just sitting on them because he knows it's blue gold and he's just waiting. And they'd put up a chart at the beginning of this conference showing the dramatic decline in water in Texas and the dramatic increase in population. It kind of was an X, population up, water down, right? But when I said to them, maybe you should think about that it's not okay for somebody to be hoarding that water for personal profit, especially when he's rich as anybody in the world, right? It was like, well, you know, we don't want to interfere with that, with capitalism or but I had a very interesting experience. I went on radio in Texas, and this man called in, and he said, I'm a deep red-blooded Republican. He said, I sweat red, white, and blue, right? And he said, I'm a wealthy businessman. I'm as conservative as they come. And he said, the little lady's right. He called me the little lady. He said, water's different. He said, you can't reproduce it. There's no such thing as competition. It's irreplaceable, and people need it for life. And he said, it's ridiculous to have water in the market system. So it's funny, you never know where you're going to get your support. The other kind of water privatization or water sales that we should be really keeping our eye on and its only beginning is the mass export or bulk commercial export of water, or the mass movement of water. And there are a number of major pipelines around the world being planned, Tibet being one of them. Another plan was Suez from the Swiss Alps. Plan to bring water from Scotland down to southern England and so on. But that's often within a more friendly kind of environment. But we can really see the possibility here in our country, I think, of massive exports, and I think we need to be quite vigilant. So what's happened is that basically we've got this great contest around water. And on the one side are those who say, okay, we're in crisis, so let's do this. Let's commodify it, let's privatize it, let's put it on the open sale for market to the highest bidder, like running shoes. And on that side are all the major institutions, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, unfortunately the UN, although they're beginning to have second thoughts at the UN, which is really interesting. Our country, I have to tell you, Canada was the only country, not even the United States did this, to vote against the right to water at an important subcommittee meeting at the United Nations. But of course, Europe is totally opposed to the right to water as well. They abstained, as did the United States, because the big water companies are in Europe. So you really do have the power elite of our world on that side. And on the other side are those of us who believe very, very deeply that when you ask the question, who owns water, the answer is nobody. Water belongs to the earth and all species. Water is a public trust. Water is the common heritage, and water is a human right. And we don't believe that anyone has the right to claim water for private gain at the expense of those who need water and cannot pay for it. And we believe these should be fundamental principles when we start talking about how to deal with our declining water stocks in the world, and how we start thinking about massive conservation. Because I think the answer to what I've put out here tonight, to these twin crises, are the twin pillars of conservation, reclamation of water on one side, and water justice on the other. And if we don't build those together, we're going to find them, I think, clashing with each other. So we're now fighting very hard for United Nations Convention on the Right to Water. I was in Bolivia a couple of weeks ago meeting with the Bolivian water minister and the Norwegian development minister, because Norway is the first northern country to tell the World Bank, no more funds for you for any water project that includes privatization. And they've pulled, yes? And they and other European countries have now pulled drinking water from their demands in the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which would have meant that if, say, Victoria privatized its water services and then 2 or 3 years down the road you decided it was a mistake, under the GATS, if we signed water into the GATS, you wouldn't be able to undo it, because you'd have to have the agreement consensus of all other countries of the WTO. Well, Europe's not going to give it because it's their countries and they're out flogging it. So this is a very exciting new movement, and we're basing it on the referendum that was held in Uruguay 2 years ago, where they actually got a ballot through a referendum on their national election for a constitutional amendment to say that water is a human right and a public service and cannot be delivered on a for-profit basis and cannot be denied to people who cannot pay for it. And that basic constitutional change is being looked at in many, many countries around the world. So there's really, I just would want to give you this feeling of excitement around the struggles around the world with the poorest of the poor, the disenfranchised, local peasants, rural farmers, sustainable farmers, indigenous peoples who are just standing together firm and with such incredible passion and dignity, and standing up and saying, you know, we didn't seem to be able to stop the end of some of our seed theft, you know, or the privatization of healthcare, but water is you just can't do that. In Cochabamba, with the first of these water wars several years ago, they brought in Bechtel, which it's not even a water company, and Bechtel's subsidiary tripled the price of water. It even charged people for the rain they were gathering on their roofs, and people said, you know, you may as well shoot us because we can't afford it and we have to have it. And there was an uprising and people were killed. The army was brought in. It was a very, very passionate confrontation. Bechtel was forced to leave. Bechtel sued under a bilateral trade investment agreement, sued the little country of Bolivia for many millions of dollars, and we made it so uncomfortable for Bechtel around the world, they finally settled for $1. They said, $1, we're out of here. So this trend has major implications for cities as well, because the three big companies have vowed that within 10 to 15 years, they want to be running 70% of the water systems in North America. They are now leaving the global south. They are coming here because they think it's a much more stable environment for them, and you can be expecting them soon.